Hello, I'm Qazi Rahman from King's College London, and my work focuses on the biological basis of human sexual orientation. I must begin by expressing warm thanks to Jane for organising this event and for the important work her foundation is doing, and for allowing me to address this audience. I must also apologise for not being there in person, but rather with you in somewhat disembodied form through the medium of film. So here I'm going to make a few remarks on the origins of human sexual orientation and talk a little bit about the implications of this work for issues that are being discussed in this meeting. I should start by saying that to many scientists, the claim that sexual orientation has a biological basis is an unremarkable thing to say. And the reason for this is that all our behaviour has a biological basis in the deep existential sense of the term. So, for example, we couldn't exist without our genome, and behaviour requires a body and a brain to deliver it. Equally, you could not exist without food or water, so clearly the environment is absolutely critical too. So in the case of sexual orientation, which is it, biology or environment? Well, firstly, genetics plays an important role, and we know this from research on twins, who are a useful natural experiment because we can compare sexuality in identical twins who share all their environment and all their genes with non-identical twins who share half their genes but all their environment. And a larger correlation between identical twins in a behavior or a trait, in this case sexual orientation, compared to the non-identical twins implicates greater genetic involvement in the trait. And studies on twins from several independent laboratories around the world show that genetic factors explain about 25 to 30% of the differences between people in their sexual orientation. So that is whether they're heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And I should say sexual orientation here in the science is defined as sexual attractions. And that is because attractions motivate behaviour and identity, not vice versa. Another finding which is important in the science of sexual orientation is gender nonconformity, particularly gender nonconformity during childhood. This refers to behaving like the opposite sex. This trait is very strongly related to adult sexual orientation. So studies which ask people about their gender nonconformity and studies which take children and follow them up, take gender non-conforming children and follow them up into adulthood, show that gay people or children who grow up to be gay are substantially more gender non-conforming during early and middle childhood than those who grow up heterosexual. This conclusion holds in both Western and non-Western cultures, including cultures in Asia, Latin America, Polynesia, and the Middle East. Now, gender nonconformity is interesting. It emerges despite conventional gender socialization. It also emerges despite the fact that many parents respond negatively to gender nonconforming behavior in their children. Some evidence also suggests that gender nonconformity emerges at roughly 2.5 years of age. So, if you like, before a pre-gay child has a sexual orientation and before they have had time to internalize social gender stereotypes. So children typically show sex-typical behavior at around 2.5 years of age, whereas they only begin to recognize the sexes and stereotypes about the sexes at around 4 years of age. And twin studies, the same twin studies I described earlier, suggest that about 40 to 50% of the differences between people in their gender nonconformity can be explained by genetic factors. So twin studies are the first look into the genetics of a trait, and what they do is tell us that there are such things as genes, and I use the word plural genes there, for sexual orientation. Separately, 3 gene-finding studies showed that gay brothers shared genetic markers on one of the sex chromosomes, the X chromosome, and a more recent study has found shared markers on some of the non-sex chromosomes too. But importantly, genes are not the whole story here. About 70 to 76% of identical twins do not share the same sexual orientation. So what twin studies also tell us, as well as telling us that genetics are important, is they tell us that the environment is also important, but not all types of environment. Twin studies are very clever because they allow us to disentangle different types of environmental influences, particularly the influence of upbringing, your family environment, from what is out there in the world, what we refer to as the unique environment. That's the environments that you and I were uniquely exposed to. And it's this unique environment that seems to matter. Family environment, on the other hand, is not at all important, according to the twin data. So the kind of unique environment that matters seems to be the prenatal one, the one that we were exposed to or developed in during early life in the womb. Girls born with a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which results in naturally increased levels of the male sex hormones, such as testosterone, during early life in the womb, show high rates of same-sex attractions as adults. Genetic males who undergo sex reassignment procedures and are reared as girls because of conditions which meant that they were born without male genitalia are typically attracted to women as adults. Now, the fact that you cannot make a genetic male sexually attracted to another male by rearing him as a girl makes any social theory of sexuality very weak indeed. Now, the evidence for commonly hypothesized social causes of homosexuality, arguments like sexual recruitment by other homosexual adults, disordered patterns of parenting, or even social tolerance, the evidence for these classes of explanations is very weak or non-existent. So gay people have same-sex desires preceding same-sex behavior by many, many years. Modestly age-discrepant sexual relationships are not uncommon for both gay and heterosexual men. So you don't need the homosexual recruitment hypothesis to explain this general male pattern of behavior. But the key findings really, which I think put a nail in the coffin of these social learning explanations, is the evidence from children of gay and lesbian parents. And the children of gay and lesbian parents are no more likely to be gay than we would expect from population base rates. Now, gay men, and to less extent lesbian women, do report being somewhat distant from their fathers, but when you account for gender nonconformity, which I described earlier, this association disappears. And this is perhaps because parents respond negatively to gender nonconformity in kids who are destined to be non-heterosexual. So in sum, and I have only briefly touched on the evidence, which is much more than I've described. But in sum, there is more evidence for non-social causes of sexual orientation than social ones. Biological hypotheses can better explain several different findings than social hypotheses can. And that should tell us which one of these explanations is more likely. So I put it to you, the audience, that these findings suggest that sexual orientation, and by that, remember, I'm referring to attractions and desires, is innate. And by innate, I mean a trait that develops in spite of social experiences. Now, some scholars, particularly those who take a postmodernist perspective, those in gender studies, or other social science perspectives, often claim that the science I've described is, for want of a better word, bunk, because sexuality, they argue, is a social construction, is a cultural construction. Or you may have heard the claim that homosexuality is a word the Victorians invented in the roughly around the 1860s, and then exported that around the world through empire. This is false. The historical record from different cultures shows that gay people, defined by their same-sex attractions as a type of person existed well before the 1800s. So typologies of same-sex attracted individuals can be traced back to ancient times, before colonialism. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes describes gay and lesbian lovers. Ancient Indian medical texts from the 1st century contain descriptions of same-sex attracted people, as I believe do texts from the late medieval period in Europe and from Islamic cultures. And for the novelists among you, English memoirs before the 1890s are filled with stories of men and women who were attracted to other men or women and who knew it. So the words homosexual or gay or lesbian did not and do not alter the condition of same-sex desire. So what about sexual fluidity, or people who appear to change sexualities? Change is widely used by some scholars to weigh against the biological argument. Again, this is false, because it is our biology that allows us to learn, allows us to socialize or respond to socialization and respond to our culture. So showing evidence of change is not an argument against a biological explanation. And there is indeed some fluidity in sexual behavior, sex acts, the type of acts people engage in, and in identity labels that people use over time, mostly among women. But there is no bell-shaped curve to sexual orientation. People may change their identity, the identity labels they use, and who they have sex with, but sexual attractions tend to stay very stable, particularly for men. Remember, sexual orientation is a pattern of desire, not of behavior or sexual acts per se. Neither is it a simple act of will or a type of performance. So I think we all need to stop pretending that there's such a thing as choice in sexual orientation. And in any case, our choices are always the result of things we didn't choose, our genes, for example, our personalities, even our upbringings. So even choices have causes. Now, people may indeed choose their sexual partners, but it still doesn't make sense to say they choose their sexual desires. So should the causes of sexuality influence how we view sexual minority identities? This really gets to the crux of what we're talking about today. The answer to this is no. The causes of a trait should not influence how we see it. If we were suddenly to discover that immense genius was due to some awful experiences people had during childhood, we would not stigmatize the genius, the trait that's an outcome of that experience, although we might rightly wish that the person had not experienced a bad childhood. The question before us really is whether a scientific theory of causation is even relevant. And one idea, one I admit to inconsistently promoting myself, is that biology authenticates gay people. It puts biology at the heart of who we are and how we came to be. But as I've suggested, it should not really matter given the principle that we cannot make claims about what ought to be based on the scientific evidence about what is the case. The issue really seems to be is whether we can change deep-seated feelings that society or some people see as undesirable. And in this case, the scientific evidence is relevant in some social and moral cases. So if, for example, you think gay people should be denied adoption rights or should not be employed as teachers because you believe homosexuality can be spread by recruitment, then this belief is likely false. Similarly, increasing criminal penalties for homosexuality in some countries is based on the belief that the social environment is a more powerful influence on sexuality. Again, this is false. I'll end by saying that to a scientist who believes in a deterministic universe, or to a naturalist, or perhaps to an atheist, all possible states of the universe are equally natural, and therefore naturalness or biologicalness cannot act as a criterion for deciding between competing social, political, and moral consequences. a biological explanation for a given state of affairs does not justify a trait or a behavior any more than a sociological explanation does. However, and I'll throw this out to the rest of the meeting really, is to people of faith, there is the argument that there exists something other than the natural and sociological realm, and that moral values and moral entities reside there and exert their influence in this world. So this presents us, for those of us with faith, with a problem of how we interpret the implications of the science of sexual orientation. And we will no doubt be discussing this further during this meeting. I thank you for your attention and thank you for your time. So a question I've been asked is, how do I know which of these the findings I've described are reputable science? And the answer is twofold. The findings I've described are based on peer-reviewed scientific research, which means the data described in the scientific paper is ripped to shreds by eminent peers, people who know what they're talking about, and anything that doesn't cut the mustard doesn't get published. Also, the findings I've described are those which have been replicated, so those which are robust and that we find time and time again. In particular, I should say that twin studies are among the most replicable findings in the field. Another question I've been asked is there any research, similar research to what I've described here, on the African continent? And I'm afraid the answer is none that I'm aware of, certainly none that fulfills the requirements of peer review and independent replication. However, it's worth saying that there is no, based on what cross-cultural evidence there is no persuasive evidence to my mind that homosexual attractions vary much from place to place. So I would predict we should expect that to be the case also in countries in Africa. One issue for the lack of research is simply that we're not able to do the research in a way that is safe, not just for the researchers, but also for those individuals who are divulging potentially illegal information about their sexual behavior. So another interesting question I've been asked is whether people can go from straight to gay or heterosexual to non-heterosexual, which is an interesting twist on the normal argument, which is that can people be made straight? So it's nice to have a refreshing question like that. Again, the answer based on the evidence for the opposite direction is no. Enduring change in a person's sexual orientation does not seem to be possible for the reasons I've described. Changing outward sexual behaviour is of course possible. Look at all those gay men and lesbian women who've been heterosexually married because of social pressures, as are the social labels we use. We now in the last 5 to 10 years have new labels that we didn't know existed. Queer has come back, for example, and pansexual, all these new traits. But behaviour change is not the same as authentic inner psychological change in one's sexual desires. Another question I've been asked, an important one, is given the evidence for a hormonal contribution, a prenatal hormonal contribution to sexual orientation, can that be changed? And the answer is, for obvious ethical reasons, is there's no research on that topic in human beings, or research at least that is rigorous enough to be published. Another good question is, what do I mean by the phrase there's no bell curve to sexual orientation? So a bell curve goes like this. If there was a bell curve to sexual orientation, it would mean most people, around 60 or so %, were in the bisexual range in terms of their sexual attractions. And studies using large-scale population level or representative studies which ask about attractions, behaviour and identity show that there isn't a bell-shaped curve. If anything, it's more like a J-shaped curve. So most people are heterosexual, roughly 95 or so %, and then a minority of people at the end, at the tip, if you like, of the J, are gay or lesbian, with an even smaller number who are bisexually identified. If we assume bisexuals are people who have various degrees of same-sex attractions. That curve is stricter for males than it is for females. So for males, you might argue that there's almost an L-shaped curve. So men tend to either be heterosexual or homosexual, but rarely in between. I realise that's a controversial thing to say. Whereas for women, there is more of a gentler curve, if you like, in that distribution. Another important question is sexuality on a spectrum? And from the remarks I've made, you might think that I've suggested it's a trait that's very much an either or. You're either gay or you're straight. And for men, that appears to be the case. Men tend to be either heterosexual or homosexual. Very few men are bisexual in terms of their sexual attractions. Again, remember, we're talking here about sexual attractions. For women, however, the picture is different. There is a little bit more of a spectrum for female sexual orientation. But again, there isn't a bell-shaped curve. That's the critical point. There are more women who are bisexual in their attractions, and there's more of them than there are men, but they tend to be at the heterosexual end of the spectrum. So the answer is, in broad terms, there is no spectrum, a true spectrum of sexual orientation, but what there is evidence or hints of more of a spectrum for women than there is for men.